I'm going to open it to the audience to ask questions, but not yet. I have a couple more. One of the things you do in this book, Craig, is solve one of the mysteries of the 1980 campaign, a mystery that actually erupted about 3 years later, and it was the mystery over the Carter briefing books. In other words, the books that Carter got as he prepared for that one head-to-head debate with Ronald Reagan. And it turned out that the Reagan campaign had gotten copies of those briefing books, which, well, you can describe the books, but I guess this story didn't break until about 3 years later, 1983. But in any case, the Reagan campaign had the briefing books, which were supposed to prepare Carter for his debate with Reagan. And among others, Carter thought George Will was the one who'd somehow gotten those books and passed them on, and he even claimed that George Will had apologized to him for having stolen those books. But what's the real story?
The real story was there was a Democratic operative who was also a labor union operative who was also involved in Communist Party politics, a fellow by the name of Paul Corbin, who had kicked around the Midwest, had been arrested for running various scams. You know Paul.
I do.
Yeah. He was a raconteur. He made enemies like he was eating breakfast. But he had become very close to the Kennedy family. He was in Wisconsin in 1960 and came to Bobby Kennedy's attention. And of course, Kennedy wins with the Wisconsin primary, so they asked Corbin to go to West Virginia to help out there. And so what Corbin does was that he gets old man Ambassador Kennedy's money, which everybody knew at the time, although nobody ever proved it. Although Paul later admitted to the FBI, and I got his FBI file, was that he went to Protestant precincts in West Virginia and handed out $10 bills to get people to vote in the primary for JFK. Now comes the election. He wins. He goes on the payroll of the family. He goes on the merchandising mart, which the Kennedy family has owned in Chicago for years, and the Joseph D. Kennedy Foundation. He's obviously very close to the family. He's there in Madison Square Garden when Marilyn Monroe sings "Happy Birthday, Mr. President."
Now get to the briefing books.
Yeah, I'm good in there. But you have to explain who this character was, because there aren't people like this in politics anymore. Corbin, as you might expect, because he's very close to the Kennedy family, is supporting Teddy in the primaries over Jimmy Carter. Of course, Kennedy loses and loses badly. And the Kennedy family was furious because they thought Carter waged a personal, unfair campaign against Teddy. Nobody is more angry about this than Corbin. So he devises a scheme for the restoration of Camelot. What he wants to do is to help Reagan defeat Carter so that Teddy can then run again in '84, taking on Reagan, who he also thought was a lightweight. So his two-part scheme is to, one, as you remember, there's a third-party candidate named John Anderson who's running the primaries. He gets his old friend Pat Lucey, who was then the governor of Wisconsin, to go on the ticket with Anderson to bleed off liberal votes from Carter in the fall election. That's step one, and he succeeds at that. Number two was that he convinces Bill Casey, who's the campaign manager for Ronald Reagan, to put him on retainer to the Reagan campaign, ostensibly to help with organized labor. Now here's this guy who had worked in Communist Party politics, so there's an FBI file with 2,000 documents in it, had been involved in Democratic politics, Kennedy politics, who is now on retainer to the Reagan campaign. Of course, Reagan doesn't know anything about this. His job ostensibly is to help with organized labor, but as a matter of fact, he's just causing trouble. One of the things that he does is that he steals Carter's briefing books out of the Carter White House and gives them to Bill Casey, who gives them to Jim Baker, who gives them to David Gergen, who gives them to from Michigan, Dave Stockman, gives them to Dave Stockman. George Will looks at them for 5 minutes, and all they are is a compilation of 30 years of Reagan speeches and columns and radio commentaries, and it was a crime to steal it, but the fact of the matter is that if anybody knew what he stood for 30 years, it was Ronald Reagan. So the fact that he had the Carter briefing books was ultimately worthless, meaningless.
And you talked to Carter. Did he accept the fact that it wasn't George Will?
What is interesting is that, like most politicians, Carter does not blame himself for his loss in 1980. Seriously, most politicians don't. They'll blame this, they'll blame that, they'll blame... Carter, when I interviewed him, was very, very helpful. He had great insight in the effect of the Panama Canal treaties on the 78 House and Senate races, and then on the 80 race, and how that had undermined his base of support with the American people. But he also was convinced that he lost because Ronald Reagan had his Greek invokes, and because the election, November 4th, 1980, was the one-year anniversary of the hostages being taken in Iran. We're still in Tehran a year later. And because Walter Cronkite had made such a big to-do about it on CBS TV News, Carter told me those are the two reasons that he lost.
Craig, you're awfully nice to Jimmy Carter in this book. And I was looking at the book again this morning, and you referred to him as a good man who had bad days.
Yes.
Rather than a bad man who had good days.
Right. Yeah, that was some wisdom I got from my mother. We were talking about a relative.
She didn't know Jimmy Carter.
No, but I like to think that the American people are very wise about these things. And that, as a matter of fact, is that if you think about the 44 men who have been elected to that office, I can really only think of one man who I would say was truly a bad man. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm a historian. I collect facts and report the facts. It's not my job to, to determine whether or not these people ultimately have bad character. I happen to think that Jimmy Carter, I stand by that statement, is that he was a good man who had bad days. He had many bad days, but he also had some good days too. I don't buy this cliche that he's somehow a great ex-president, all that nonsense. I mean, the Habitat for Humanity stuff is fine, but the foreign policy quarters, I think, are ridiculous. But I'm probably going to upset some people here, but I think that the American people have gotten it right 43 out of 44 elections in terms of judging character, and that's what in the
federal. Right, what was the other one?
Nixon. I think Nixon was a bad man. I mean, he was bad character.
Bad character. Okay.